on the other side of the ball, because Anthony, it seemed unlikely that the Bengals are going to be able to replace both Jermaine Pratt and Geno Stone in one off season, even if obviously both players last year didn't perform at their best. The Bengals decided essentially to move on from Jermaine Pratt and stick with Geno Stone for at least another year. And Geno Stone is interesting because we forget that he's essentially the same age as a guy who's in the last year of his rookie contract. And despite the fact that this is his second team in his second contract, he entered the league really young at like 21, coming out of Iowa for the Ravens. He spent a handful of years there, and then he signed with the Bengals at only 25, 24 years old. I think he was actually 24 years old when he put pen to paper, and then he turned 25 before the season began. But for someone who's now going to be 26, entering his second contract year, this is the most important season of Geno Stone's career. It's not even a question. And considering the fact that last year didn't start anywhere near the way that the Bengals or Geno or the fans wanted it to, it only adds to that pressure, because it was viewed as a really good value signing when the Bengals signed him into free agency, someone that could play the post safety role a lot better than what Dax Hill was able to do as a rookie or as a second-year player in 2023. And they realized that that's not the player that Geno Stone is. And they tried to just fit a square peg into a round hole, and the defense suffered because of that. And so much of Louis Narumo's defense was dependent on the effectiveness of his safeties. And Geno Stone just couldn't provide that until some changes were made, obviously, to the scheme on defense. And then all of a sudden the interceptions started coming down. The playmaking ability that showed up on tape for Geno Stone and the Ravens, that started to show up. And I think part of that played into their willingness to say, hey, if we don't find or don't pull the trigger on a safety in the NFL draft, we're at least comfortable with giving Stone one last chance here. And this is going to be his one last chance. And the fact that it is a contract year, that only adds to the importance of it. And the fact that there is no Justin Simmons or Julian Blackmon in the building probably isn't going to be that case anyways. There's no Xavier Watts that was drafted to replace him, no Kevin Winston that was drafted to replace him. It's all on him. And it's basically just either him or a Tyson Anderson if he gets an opportunity, if things don't progress the way that they need to in the season. I think obviously he's safe throughout training camp and the preseason. He still needs to look the part, obviously. But once the season begins, like, the clock is starting to tick for Geno Stone. And I don't know how long of a leash he'll have with Tyson Anderson kind of looking over his shoulder. Obviously, it's not the ideal situation. At best, you can stretch it into a Sean Williams type situation where he was obviously a special teams savant in his early years with the Bengals in the mid-2010s, and then he got his chance to play next to Reggie Nelson, and also he earned an extension in 2016. Like, maybe that is the path for Tyson Anderson supplanting a Geno Stone, but that would have to be the worst-case scenario if Stone doesn't progress the way that he showed he could at the end of last season. So this is an extremely important year for Geno Stone, a player that obviously a lot of fans, I think, wanted to move on from, but he's still here, and now all is on the table for him to kind of make the most of it.
If you go back to when we were entering 2024 free agency and Stone's name was getting kicked around as a possibility for the Bengals, and then they ultimately signed him, which was somewhat predictable in a lot of different ways. But if you remember, what did he have with the Ravens that year? Like 6 or 7 interceptions, I think.
7.
Yeah. So if you remember the year prior, they had Dax Hill, and it wasn't just Dax that was showing this problem, but Dax Hill had his hands on probably 3 or 4 different balls that should have been interceptions. And so when we talked about Stone coming to Cincinnati, you go, okay, maybe they move Dax Hill around to something else and he'll take the next step. And then Stone's going to be the guy that can be, get you those big plays, that sort of thing. And it didn't really happen, as you mentioned, until the very end of the year. And the Bengals were playing, I think what was one, a pick six, I think was against Will Levis, if I'm not mistaken. And some of the teams and some of the quarterbacks they were going up against, okay, but you play with who's on your schedule and you play who's in front of you. And kudos to Stone for turning around what was an abysmal start to the season to making some nice plays and helping the Bengals almost get to the playoffs by winning all those games at the end of the year there. It's still this question of, okay, what was so different about the end of last year that caused a player like Stone, Joseph Osai, and others to really take that next step? And will the new defensive coordinator, Al Golden, be able to kind of harness that or build off of what they were doing at the end there and continue that momentum that we saw from the defense at the end of the year. And so that's just a big question mark. And we keep kind of stating the same thing in a different way, but this all comes down to really trusting and believing what Al Golden is bringing to the table. And is he going to get the right players out there? Is he going to get the most of them out there? I thought it was very telling that the Bengals passed on Xavier Watts, a safety that Al Golden loved, 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like you said, they didn't go after really anyone else in that regard. So yeah, they had other players, and not every single pick was going to go on the defensive side of the ball, but you kind of figured that if they were, that was probably one of the guys that they were going to target, because he's Golden's golden boy, right? Watts was. So I think that may show a little bit of the confidence that they have in what they can get out of Geno Stone and others from the defense based on what we saw towards the end of the last year.
And I'll just say this, like I did hear that the Bengals, there are people in the building that wanted to draft a safety or expecting a safety to be drafted. I think sometimes when teams pass on positions of need, it kind of gets viewed as, oh, well, clearly they're comfortable at that spot. And to an extent that is true, but I think there was still an expectation in some parts of the building that at the very least more competition would be coming for Stone. And maybe they're not as comfortable as we may think that it is just because they passed on Watts. Like if they had signed like a starting guard in free agency, maybe they end up going with Watts over a Dylan Fairchild. Like the nature of the entire offseason, it resulted in the draft that we saw. But I also think that it's interesting with how, in terms of the differences between Anarumo and Golden, it's very clear that Golden wanted to build his defense from like the spine up, in terms of like linebackers are leading the charge, which makes sense because he's the linebackers guy and everything like that. But still, tackling is so important to his defense, and it should be for any defense. But it was one of the points of emphasis that he listed out when he was hired. And like Geno Stone, even in his good days with Baltimore, was not a good tackler, and it's right. I don't think it's an issue that's going away necessarily. So his playmaking abilities, I think, are still very much there, and they can be maximized more in a similar scheme that we saw at the end of last year. But if the tackling issues persist, like that is the main thing that can make or break Geno Stone's final year in Cincinnati. If this is his final year in Cincinnati, because I can't imagine the leash is going to be that long if he's consistently taking bad angles like he did last year and more explosive plays are given up. Like Tyson Anderson at that point, he can't just be riding on the bench when Geno Stone is doing this in front of him. But at the end of the day, like if he doesn't work out this year, that is 2 defensive coordinators, 2 schemes on the same team that he didn't perform well, and he enters free agency potentially losing a lot of money. But he can also gain a lot of money if he shows that out to be the player that they signed in the first place.
And all of this still goes back to, and I don't want to diminish the talents of Geno Stone or others, but all of this still goes back to Jesse Bates. You decided not to re-sign Jesse Bates. You assert Dax Hill into that lineup. You assert Nick Scott, right? I mean, you got all these guys in here, and it's like, oh man, all of those guys just it all adds up to, you're chasing your tail because you didn't re-sign a star here. But hopefully Stone is like the guy that we saw at the end of 2024, and the Bengals continue to improve their defense. We'll see, though. It's a tall ask. But that is the first edition of Make or Break players. So hopefully you like that. We may still do potential breakout, but this is a little bit of a different spin. We just said Jermaine Burton isn't having pressure on him. Here we are on this show putting pressure on him as the Make or Break year. Of course, that's what we do.